Buenos dias, you all. All enlightened, Eurocentric, philosophical thoughts and movements are detrimental to communities of color. All. When the French sing out liberté, égalité, and fraternité, it does not include their future colonies in Vietnam or in Algiers. Liberation, equality, and freedom was only for Europeans, not for their colonized. And here's the thing, how do you develop a way of thinking that calls for liberation but excludes an entire group of people? And the way you do that is by creating abstract philosophical thoughts that are so dense that we have no idea what they're saying, but we say it must be good because we don't understand it. John Rawls, bless his heart, loved by the Wall Street Journal for some reason, is a good example of creating this way of detaching one's consciousness from one's body to create an ethical paradigm that at the end continues to be detrimental to communities of color. By universalizing the human experience based on the social location of white Europeans, delegitimizes the philosophical contributions made by the colonized, relegated to the underside of history. Let me give you an example. Hegel. We all love Hegel. Dialectical history, salvation history. We're all moving towards a better future. We're all moving upward towards hope. According to Hegel, the construct of history is based on a narrative of stages, in where history moves from the East to the West to Central Europe, where it reaches its height. Now, excluded from history is Africa, Asia, American natives, and Spain, because we were too Africanized, according to Hegel. In other words, we are outside of history. History does not belong to us because we are too inferior to even participate in history. And we only participate in history when the colonizer happens to invade us and colonize us. Then we enter the history books. So, why should I be shocked when our oath of liberty and justice for all was never meant to include communities of color? So before confronting our opponents, we need to confront ourselves. I would argue our mind is so colonized that the only way we can talk about liberation is through the use of Eurocentric worldview paradigms that are designed for our own oppression. We embrace Eurocentric faith concepts like hope, which basically pacifies us, leading us to call for spiritual liberation while ignoring physical liberation, believing in the riches of the hereafter than the riches of the here and now. And our minds are so colonized that I have no doubt God vomits over our colonized minds. José Martí, which you probably don't know much about, but is probably one of the greatest philosophical thinkers of the last century, of the 19th century, said, "El vino de plátano, si sale agrio, sigue siendo nuestro vino." Now, for those of you who lack the dexterity to sing in the language of the angels, let me translate his simple verses for you. José Martí is saying, "We shall make our wine out of plantains, and if it tastes sour, it is still our wine." And what Martí is trying to tell us, he was looking at his time, the end of the 19th century, and noticing that these philosophical movements that are occurring in Europe are designed to colonize the entire world, and he's saying we cannot follow their way of thinking. We must develop our own way of thinking. This is followed by Miguel de Unamuno, who also says that the Eurocentric idea, the Germanic idea of the rationale is killing us. We need a way of thinking that does not include rational Enlightenment thinking. But our minds are too colonized that we can't even begin to even think what something like that would look like. How do we learn to see with our own eyes? How do we reject the Eurocentric philosophical supremacy that we learn from the moment we begin kindergarten? Now, in a shameless act of self-promotion, I have a book coming out in November by Fortress Press, which is called Embracing the Hopelessness, which begins to look at people like Miguel de Unamuno as a way of dismantling a Eurocentric Enlightenment way of thinking to try to figure out how do we create our own philosophy, one that does not include our own oppression. The last chapter of the book, the title of that last chapter, I cannot repeat in a church setting because there's a certain four-letter word that begins with F. But I have no other word, I have no other intellectual, scholarly word to say in the face of the fact that every 4 days, 5 brown bodies die in the desert. That's the only word I could think of to end that chapter. That's the only academic word that comes to mind. Confronting our opponents. I'm going to ask a few difficult questions, and please bear with me because I don't know the answers. And I really mean this. I don't know the answers. I just want to share my struggle. Cesar Chavez says, I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who's trying to be nonviolent. See, as a man of color, I get concerned that the dominant culture's conversation about nonviolence is to keep me in check. Once Pax Americana is established, nonviolence becomes the moral initiative. From my social location of marginality, I must ask, is the talk of nonviolence a new form of oppression for me? You see, if I get a gun and put it in the face of a 10-year-old and pull the trigger and shoot them, or shoot the child, it's obviously a violent act. I would be called a bad hombre. But if a bunch of white men in pinstripe suits eliminates that child's health care, they're called congressmen. Why is my violence different from their violence? The exception is their violence has been so institutionalized that we don't see it as violence. So I have to ask, if Martin Luther King Jr. is correct that the United States is the greater exporter of institutional and physical violence in the world, then quite frankly, the United States has lost all moral authority to tell me anything about violence or nonviolence. I am a nonviolent man I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man trying to be nonviolent. I remember when I was in Mexico at a Christian-based community, in where Chiapas rebel I was talking to said to me one day, you know, I went to the government because they were taxing me so much that I was afraid I was going to lose my land. And they looked at me and said, you smelly Indian, get out of here. So I showed up the next day with a bandana and an AK-47, and you know what? They listened to me. We had an interesting conversation. There was something about the threat of violence that get people to the table to talk. Now, hear me out. I'm not calling for violence. I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who is trying to be nonviolent. And I realize that unless blood flows, nothing changes. Unfortunately, it's always the blood of the marginalized, of the oppressed. That's the blood that usually flows, but that's the blood that flows if we hope for any type of change. Because I don't know of any historical account in where oppressors and colonizers said, you know, we have too much power. Here, why don't you have some? You know. without the flow of blood. I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who is trying to be nonviolent. Good old Southern Baptist, I have to at least do one Bible verse. Exodus 2:11 through 22, and where Moses kills a member of the dominant culture for beating one of the marginalized. And God doesn't punish Moses, but instead calls Moses to lead his people out of bondage. I'm struggling with that verse and what that verse implies. Because to do nothing in the face of institutional violence is to be complicit with that violence. To do nothing allows the prevailing violence to continue. Do I have a preferential option for the oppressed, which means justifying the violence towards the oppressor? That's a hard question. I don't know the answer. I'm just struggling with the question. Moses' act led to his exile and eventually to the exodus of his people. I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who is trying to be nonviolent. I think of people like Nat Turner, the preacher, who led a bloody rebellion against slavery. I think of Moses killing the slaveholder oppressor. I'm not willing to say that neither one of them acted outside of God. Because whites benefited from Turner's slavery, Turner was labeled the terrorist and the violent one. Can violence be part of revolutionary love? That's really a hard question. And again, I don't know the answer because I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who's trying to be nonviolent. And you know, if I have to die for my faith, that's the easy part. I'm old enough now that, that's okay. It's easy to die for one's faith. But if I'm honest with you, if you touch a hair of one of my children, I will rip your heart out in Christian love. If I'm honest with you, I have to be honest with myself here. So the idea of not being violent sounds great until you touch one of my children. And I have to reconcile that with trying to be nonviolent. I wish I knew the proper ethical response to this. And as an ethicist, this has been my challenge. I don't know what to do. I do know that the discussion of nonviolence should not be left to the dominant culture. It is a conversation for those who are facing the violence, those whose lives are impacted because they live with the consequences of violence. I guess the only thing I could say with any integrity is that I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man trying to be nonviolent. Thank you.